300 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, there is no sunlight. There's no fresh air. There's only crushing, black pressure. At this depth, the water exerts over 130 pounds of pressure on every single square inch of surface area. If you were exposed to it, your lungs would collapse instantly. The only thing keeping 80 American sailors alive in this hostile alien world is a layer of high tensile steel, less than an inch thick. They called it the silent service. It was the most dangerous job in the Second World War. The death rate for U.S. submariners was 22%, the highest of any branch of the armed forces. In the infantry, if you are hit, you might be wounded, you get a medic. You go home. In the submarine service, there are no wounded. If the hull is breached, the ocean rushes in with the force of a freight train. The end is instant, violent, and final. These ships were weapons of stealth and terror. But to the men who lived inside them, sweating in the tropical heat, breathing recycled air, and waiting for the terrifying sound of depth charges, they had another name. They called them Iron Coffins. This is the story of the greatest of them all, the USS Tang and the men who rowed her to glory. And finally, to the bottom of the sea. To understand the war of the USS Tang, you must first understand the machine itself. The Tang was a Balao-Class submarine. Launched in 1943, she was the pinnacle of American underwater technology. She was 311 feet long, about the length of a football field, but only 27 feet wide at her widest point. Into this steel cigar, the Navy packed massive diesel engines, tons of batteries, 24 torpedoes, and 80 men. It was a world built for machinery, not for humans. Every man on board was a volunteer. You had to pass rigorous psychological testing just to get into sub school. They were looking for men who wouldn't crack under pressure, men who could handle the profound isolation of spending 60 days at sea without ever seeing the sun. They were the elite. They were paid extra hazardous duty pay, and when they returned to port at Pearl Harbor, Australia, they were treated like kings, given the best hotels and the coldest beer. But at sea, they lived like troglodytes. The first thing a new sailor noticed when the hatch clanged shut was the smell. A world where the second submarine had a unique, inescapable odor. It was a thick stew of diesel fumes, battery acid, hydraulic fluid, cigarette smoke, cooking grease, and the unwashed bodies of 80 men sharing 2 tiny showers that they were rarely allowed to use. Because fresh water was precious. After 2 weeks on patrol, the air was thick enough to chew. When they surfaced at night to recharge the batteries, the fresh Pacific air rushing down the conning tower felt like champagne. Then there was the heat. In the tropical waters of the South Pacific, operating submerged during the day to avoid Japanese aircraft, the temperature inside the boat regularly climbed over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with 100% humidity. The steel walls sweated condensation. The men wore nothing but shorts and sandals, towel wrapped around their necks, their bodies slick with sweat that would not evaporate in the damp air. It was a physical ordeal just to exist, let alone fight. A war. The boat was divided into watertight compartments, separated by heavy steel doors. Forward, torpedo room, the business end. 6 torpedo tubes loaded with Mark 14 or the newer electric Mark 18 fish. This was also the berthing area for the lowest-ranking crewmen. They slept on racks tucked between the sleek, deadly shapes of the reload torpedoes. They literally slept with their ammunition. Control room, the brain of the ship. This was crowded with valves, gauges, the periscope stand, and the diving plainsmen who controlled the depth of the boat. It was here that the captain directed the attack, peering through the periscope, doing complex trigonometry in his head to calculate the intercept course. Engine rooms, the roaring heart. Massive Fairbanks Morse diesel engines that sounded like thunder when running on the surface. They charged the batteries that powered the silent electric motors used when submerged. The noise in these rooms was deafening, the heat unbearable. aft torpedo room, the rear guard. 4 more torpedo tubes ready to fire at pursuers or finish off a damaged target as the sub turned away. Space was so limited that the concept of hot bunking was standard. 3 men would share 2 bunks when one man got up to go on watch. Another man, exhausted from his shift, would climb into the warm sheets he just vacated. There was no privacy. There was no escape from your shipmates. The primary defense of the submarine was invisibility. And invisibility meant silence. Water conducts sound 5 times faster and farther than air. A dropped wrench in the engine room could sound like a church bell to a Japanese destroyer's hydrophones miles away. When the order rigged for silent running was given, the boat transformed. The ventilation fans were turned off. The temperature soared. Men stopped talking, communicating only in whispers or hand signals. They walked in stocking feet. No one was allowed to use the head, the toilet, because the sound of the flushing pump could give them away. They sat in the sweating, silent darkness waiting. They waited while the Japanese destroyers above them began their hunt. They listened to the ping dot dot bang dot pang dot pang dot of the enemy active sonar bouncing off their hull. Each ping was a finger pointing right at them dot, and then they waited for the depth charges. A depth charge attack was the ultimate psychological torture. The crew could hear the splashes as the oil drums filled with explosives hit the water above them. They counted the seconds as they sank. 1001, 1002. The explosions were terrifying. The boat would be hammered violently, whipped sideways. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the ceiling. Leaks would spring in hydraulic lines, spraying hot oil. The men just had to sit there and take it. They couldn't fight back while submerged. They had to trust their captain's evasive maneuvers and trust the steel of the pressure hull to hold. Some men broke. They screamed or tried to claw open the hatches. They had to be physically restrained and sedated by their shipmates. A panicked man could kill everyone on board. Yet despite the heat, the smell, and the terror, the crews of the U.S. submarine fleet were the most aggressive warriors in the Pacific. They were hunters. They were apex predators patrolling a vast oceanic jungle. Unlike the surface fleet, which operated in massive task forces, the submarine operated alone. Once they left Pearl Harbor or Midway, they were on their own for 2 months. Radio silence was strictly enforced. If they got into trouble, no one was coming to save them. This bred a unique type of sailor, independent, resourceful, and lethally focused. By 1943, the U.S. submarine force had strangled the Japanese Empire. They were sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. They were starving the home islands of oil, rubber, and food. But among this elite force, there was one boat that would rise above the rest. A boat that would become a legend for its aggressiveness, its luck, and its staggering kill count. The USS Tang was about to be launched, and it was waiting for the captain who would forge it into the deadliest weapon in the Pacific. His name was Richard O'Kane, and he was about to rewrite the rule book on submarine warfare, in the early years of the Pacific War. The U.S. submarine force had a problem. It wasn't the boats. The boats were good. It wasn't the crews. The crews were eager. The problem was the captains. Many of the pre-war commanders were peacetime sailors. They were trained in caution. They were taught that a submarine was a scouting vessel, a fragile observer that should fire from long range and dive deep at the first sign of trouble. They treated their submarines like precious eggs that must not be broken. But by 1943, a new breed of officer was rising through the ranks. These men didn't care about caution. They didn't care about the rule book. They viewed the submarine not as a scout, but as a shark. Foremost among this new generation was a quiet, intense man from New Hampshire named Richard Hetherington O'Kane. O'Kane was not a shouter. He wasn't a table pounder. He was an intellectual, a man of precise calculation and icy nerves. He possessed a terrifying ability to visualize the geometry of an attack in his head speed, distance, angle while depth charges were exploding around him. But O'Kane didn't learn to kill on his own. He learned at the right hand of the master. Before he commanded the Tang, he was the executive officer, XO, of the legendary USS Wahoo, serving under the most famous submarine ace of the war, Dudley "Mush" Morton. The partnership between Morton and O'Kane on the Wahoo changed naval history. They were opposites. Morton was big, loud, and aggressive, a bear of a man who famously told his crew, "We will shoot anyone, anywhere at any time." O'Kane was his cool, analytical counterpart, the man who translated Morton's fury into mathematical firing solutions. Together, they rewrote the tactics of submarine warfare. Before the Wahoo, captains would fire sonar-guided shots from deep underwater, hoping for a hit. Morton and O'Kane preferred the end around. They would spot a convoy on the horizon. Instead of diving, they would stay on the surface, using their superior speed to race around the convoy, out of sight range, until they were ahead of the enemy. Then, they would submerge and lie in wait, letting the target sail right into their CROSSHAIRS. They also pioneered the down-the-throat shot. Traditionally, firing at a destroyer that was charging straight at you was considered suicide. The profile was too narrow to hit. The doctrine said, dive deep and pray. Morton and O'Kane flipped the script. They reasoned that a charging destroyer was the easiest target to hit because its course was predictable. It was coming right for you. They would wait until the destroyer was terrifyingly close, then fire a spread of torpedoes straight down its bearing line. It was a game of chicken played with high explosives. If you missed, the destroyer would ram you or drop depth charges on your conning tower. If you hit, you blew the attacker in half. On the Wahoo, O'Kane stood at the periscope for hours, learning the art of the kill. He saw the ships explode. He saw the Japanese sailors in the water. He learned that in total war, mercy is a luxury a submariner cannot afford. By late 1943, the Navy realized that Dick O'Kane was too valuable to be a number two. They gave him his own boat. She was brand new, still smelling of fresh paint and welding ozone. She was the USS Tang, S-306. O'Kane was given a rare privilege. He was allowed to handpick his crew. He scoured the submarine base at Mare Island. He didn't want rookies, he wanted veterans. He wanted men who had already looked death in the eye and hadn't blinked. He poached the best torpedomen, the best machinists, and the best electricians from other boats. He built an all-star team. Among them was Frank Springer, a sharp-eyed chief petty officer, Clay Decker, a torpedoman's mate who knew the erratic Mark 14 torpedoes inside out, and Bill Libold, the chief bosun's mate, a man of immense physical strength and loyalty who would stay by O'Kane's side until the bitter end. O'Kane gathered his crew on the deck of the Tang. He didn't give a speech about glory. He gave them a promise. He told them that he would never take them into danger without a calculated plan. He told them he would push the boat to its absolute limit. And he told them that their job was simple: sink ships. The Tang was not going to be a patrol boat. It was going to be an exterminator. O'Kane's command philosophy was radical. He believed that the safest place for a submarine during an attack was often on the surface, submerged. A submarine is slow, barely 3 or 4 knots. It is blind, relying on a periscope that can only see a few miles. On the surface, the Tang could do 20 knots. She had radar. She had excellent visibility from the bridge. O'Kane decided he would fight his submarine like a torpedo boat. He would attack at night, on the surface, amidst the confusion of the enemy convoy. He would rely on the Tang's low silhouette and high speed to dodge the escort ships. weaving through the merchant vessels, firing torpedoes point-blank. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It required a crew that could function flawlessly, while enemy shells splashed into the water around them. It required a captain with ice water in his veins. The Tang departed Pearl Harbor for her first war patrol in January 1944. She headed for the Caroline Islands and the Marianas. The crew was tense. Training is one thing, combat is another. They waited for the first contact. It came on the night of February 17th. A Japanese convoy, O'Kane, ordered battle surface. The alarm klaxon, Ahuga, sounded throughout the boat. The men rushed to their stations. O'Kane stood on the bridge, binoculars around his neck, the sea spray hitting his face. He maneuvered the Tang into the middle of the convoy. Fire 1. The boat shuddered as the compressed air launched the first torpedo. Fire 2. The seconds ticked by. Then a flash of orange light on the horizon. A dull, heavy WHUMP that vibrated through the hull plates. Hit, hot run, normal explosion, the crew cheered. But O'Kane didn't celebrate. He was already calculating the solution for the next target. He spun the boat, lining up the stern tubes. That night, the Tang sank the cargo ship Gyoten Maru and the transport Taijin Maru. It was a textbook execution of O'Kane. Aggressive doctrine. But it was just the warm dash up. Over the next few months, the Tang became the most feared boat in the Pacific. O'Kane drove his crew relentlessly. He attacked convoys in broad daylight. He attacked them in shallow water. He attacked them when he was out of torpedoes, surfacing to use the deck gun to finish off cripples. The crew began to trust him blindly. They saw that his risks were calculated. They saw that he always left a door open for escape. They also saw his humanity. O'Kane was a strict disciplinarian, but he loved his men. He ensured they had the best food. He checked on their morale. He was the old man, though he was only 33, the father figure of the steel tube. By the summer of 1944, the Tang had racked up an incredible score, but O'Kane wasn't satisfied. He felt the war closing in. The targets were getting harder to find. In the open ocean. To find the enemy, he would have to go where no other American submarine dared to go. He would have to take the Tang into the Yellow Sea, the shallow, mine-infested waters between China and Japan. It was considered suicide territory. The water was so shallow that a submarine couldn't dive deep to escape depth charges. If you were spotted, you were dead. But that's exactly where the Japanese ships were hiding. And that's exactly where Dick O'Kane was going to take them. By 1944, the Pacific War had changed. The early days of the submarine war, characterized by faulty torpedoes and cautious captains, were over. The U.S. Navy had a new weapon, one that fundamentally altered the predator-prey relationship: SJ radar. Before radar, a submarine at night was just a boat with binoculars. If it was cloudy or moonless, the captain was blind. He had to guess where the enemy was, but the USS Tang was equipped with the latest SJ surface search radar. In the darkened corner of the conning tower, a radar operator watched a glowing green screen. A sweeping line of light painted the world in radio waves. This radar could detect a Japanese battleship at 20,000 yards. It could spot a small freighter at 10,000 yards. Crucially, it could give the precise range and bearing of the target. For a mathematician like Dick O'Kane, this was the holy grail. He didn't have to guess anymore. He could plot the enemy's course, speed, and zigzag pattern with mathematical certainty, long before the Japanese lookouts could see him. The Tang wasn't just hunting. She was stalking. With the radar advantage, O'Kane perfected a maneuver known as the end around. When the radar picked up a convoy, the Tang wouldn't dive. Diving was slow. Instead, O'Kane would keep the Tang on the surface, utilizing her 4 massive diesel engines to reach flank speed over 20 knots. he would race through the darkness, swinging wide around the convoy, staying just out of visual range, but keeping the targets firmly on his radar screen. He would outrun the Japanese ships, loop ahead of them, and position himself directly in their path. Then he would wait. He wouldn't submerge until the very last moment, or sometimes not at all. O'Kane's most terrifying innovation was the night surface attack. Conventional wisdom said that a submarine on the surface was a sitting duck. It had no armor. A single shell from a destroyer could puncture the pressure hull, preventing it from ever diving again. But O'Kane realized that at night, the Tang's low silhouette made her almost invisible against the black water. He reasoned. If I dive, I am slow and blind. If I stay up, I am fast and I can see. He turned the Tang into a torpedo boat. He would penetrate the screen of escorting destroyers, slipping right between them in the dark. He would drive the submarine into the center of the Japanese convoy. It was a tactic of supreme audacity. The Tang would be surrounded by enemy ships, tankers, freighters, troop transports looming like skyscrapers above her low deck. O'Kane would stand on the bridge, using the target-bearing transmitter, TBT, a set of heavy, waterproof binoculars mounted on a stand to designate targets. Set. Fire 1. The torpedo would leave the tube with a whoosh of compressed air. Shift target. Stern tubes. Fire 7. In the chaos of a convoy battle, O'Kane would spin the ship, firing torpedoes from both the bow and the stern, picking off targets in all directions. The result was absolute pandemonium for the Japanese. Explosions would rip through the night. Tankers would turn into pillars of fire, illuminating the sea. The Japanese destroyers, panicked and confused, would start firing their guns wildly, searching for the attacker. Often in the confusion, the Japanese ships would collide with each other or fire on their own. Merchant vessels. And right in the middle of this inferno sat the USS Tang, silhouetted by the burning ships, with Dick O'Kane calmly calling out the next firing solution. The crew in the control room below could hear the explosions through the hull. They could hear the screws of the Japanese destroyers churning the water overhead. They trusted O'Kane with their lives, but the tension was unbearable. They knew that one lucky searchlight beam, one star shell popping overhead, would reveal them to every gunner in the Japanese fleet. Once the torpedoes were away and the convoy was burning, the hard part began, the escape. The Japanese destroyers, enraged and vengeful, would converge on the firing point. They would charge at full speed, looking to ram the submarine or drop depth charges. This was where O'Kane's nerves were tested. He would hold his ground on the surface until the last possible second, verifying his hits. Then, the order would come. Clear the bridge. Dive, dive, dive. The lookouts would drop down the hatch. O'Kane would be the last man down, pulling the lanyard to close the heavy steel hatch behind him. Take her deep, 300 feet, rig for silent running. The vents would open, releasing the air from the ballast tanks with a deafening roar. The Tang would slide beneath the waves, angling steeply toward the safety of the deep. Seconds later, the depth charges would start. Kablam! Kablam! The ocean would hammer the hull. The men would hold onto pipes and bunks, their eyes wide, dust falling from the overheads. They would wait in the silence, listening to the destroyers circling above, hunting for the iron coffin. But O'Kane was already thinking ahead. As soon as the destroyers lost contact, he would bring the boat back up to periscope depth, looking for the stragglers, looking for the next kill. By the spring of 1944, the Tang's success was becoming legendary. On her second patrol, she didn't just hunt ships. She hunted survivors. The Tang was assigned to lifeguard duty near the Japanese stronghold of Truk. Carrier airstrikes were pounding the island. American pilots were being shot down into the lagoon. The Tang brazenly sailed into the waters around Truk under the guns of the Japanese shore batteries. O'Kane maneuvered the sub through coral reefs, picking up downed aviators. He rescued 22 airmen in a single patrol, a record that stands to this day. To fit them all, the submariners gave up their bunks, sleeping on torpedoes or on the steel deck plates. The Tang returned to Pearl Harbor with a Jolly Roger flag flying from her periscope, adorned with symbols of sunk ships and rescued pilots. O'Kane was awarded the Navy Cross. The crew was celebrated. But the war wasn't over. The Japanese shipping lanes were shrinking. The enemy was hugging the coastlines, moving into shallower waters where American submarines couldn't follow, or so they thought. Dick O'Kane looked at the charts. He saw the Yellow Sea, the body of water between China and Japan. It was shallow. It was heavily mined. It was patrolled by aircraft. No American submarine had successfully raided it in force. O'Kane tapped the map. "That's where they are," he said. "And that's where we're going." The Tang was about to leave the deep ocean behind and enter the Emperor's backyard. Asterisk in June 1944. The Pacific Ocean was vast, deep, and largely under American control. But there was one corner of the map that remained a Japanese lake, the Yellow Sea. Lying between the coast of China and the Korean Peninsula. The Yellow Sea was the industrial artery of the Japanese Empire. It was the highway for ships carrying coal, iron ore, and troops to the war in China. It was also a submariner's nightmare. The average depth of the Pacific Ocean is 13,000 feet. The average depth of the Yellow Sea is barely 150 feet for a submarine. Like the Tang, which was over 300 feet long and required 60 feet of vertical space just to submerge safely, operating in 150 feet of water was suicidal. It meant there was no deep to run to. If a destroyer attacked, you couldn't dive under the thermal layers to hide. You couldn't evade depth charges by going to test depth. You were trapped between the surface and the mud. Furthermore, the water was filled with sediment from the Great Rivers of China. It was murky and brown, blinding the periscope. And the Japanese had sown the entrances with thousands of contact mines. No American submarine had successfully patrolled the heart of this sea in force. It was considered a sanctuary for Japanese shipping. Dick O'Kane looked at the charts. He saw the depth soundings, he saw the minefields, and he saw the target-rich environment. He told his crew, "If the water is deep enough to float the boat, it's deep enough to fight in." The Tang slipped into the Yellow Sea in late June. The tension on board was palpable. The depth gauge in the control room rarely read more than 180 feet. The sonar man reported the sound of the ocean floor rushing by just beneath the keel. O'Kane knew that in these waters, stealth was impossible during the day. The Japanese aircraft patrolling from the Chinese coast would spot the dark shape of the sub against the muddy bottom. So O'Kane adopted a tactic of extreme aggression. He stayed on the surface at night, charging his batteries and hunting. During the day, he would bottom the ship, literally resting the Tang on the mud of the seafloor, and turn everything off. The crew would sit in silent darkness, listening to the screws of Japanese ships passing overhead, praying that a dragging anchor chain wouldn't snag their hull. But when the sun went down, the Tang rose from the mud like a sea monster. The hunting was spectacular. The Japanese captains, believing they were safe in their home waters, were sailing with lights on, often unescorted. On the night of June 24th, the Tang intercepted a massive convoy bound for Kyushu. O'Kane didn't hesitate. He drove the Tang right into the middle of the formation. The water was so shallow that the wake of the submarine churned up mud. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. The torpedo streaked out. The range was point-blank less than 1,000 yards. The explosions were deafening. One tanker, loaded with aviation fuel, disintegrated in a ball of fire that lit up the horizon for 20 miles. The shockwave rocked the Tang violently. The Japanese escorts panicked. They began firing star shells, illuminating the night. They raced around, dropping depth charges on suspected contacts, but O'Kane didn't dive. He knew that if he dived in this shallow water, the depth charges would crush him against the bottom. Instead, he used the confusion. He kept the Tang on the surface, weaving between the burning hulks of his victims. Using the smoke for cover, he was fighting a submarine like a PT boat. The targets were so plentiful that the Tang faced a new problem. Running out of torpedoes, a Balao-Class submarine carried 24 torpedoes. In a target-rich environment like the Yellow Sea, O'Kane had to make every shot count. He became a miser with his ammunition. He stopped firing spreads of 3 or 4. He began firing single shots, aiming for the engine rooms of the enemy ships. To break their backs, his accuracy was supernatural. The crew began to believe that the old man couldn't miss, but the stress on O'Kane was immense. In the shallow waters, he couldn't leave the bridge. He stayed topside for days at a time, surviving on coffee and cigarettes. His eyes red-rimmed, his binoculars glued to his chest. He personally oversaw every approach, every calculation, every escape. He was the brain and the eyes of the ship. If he slept, the Tang was blind. On July 4, 1944, Independence Day, the Tang celebrated with fireworks of her own. O'Kane spotted a freighter near the coast of Darren, China. He moved in to attack. But this time, the freighter was protected. A Japanese destroyer charged out of the mist, guns blazing. In deep water, the move would have been to dive. In the Yellow Sea, O'Kane had to stand and fight. He turned the Tang's stern toward the destroyer, presenting the smallest possible target. He waited. The destroyer closed the distance, 2,000 yards, 1,500 yards. The shells were splashing closer, spraying water over the bridge. O'Kane waited until the destroyer was committed to its course. Then, he fired 3 torpedoes from the stern, tubes down the throat. The torpedoes raced toward the bow of the onrushing warship. The Japanese captain saw the wakes and tried to turn, but it was too late. 2 torpedoes struck the destroyer. The ship broke in half. The boiler exploded. Within minutes, the hunter was gone, erased from the surface. The Tang crew, listening on the sonar, heard the terrible breaking up noises of the dying ship. There was no cheering. Killing a warship was different from killing a merchantman. It was a professional victory, grim and necessary. By the end of the patrol, the Tang was empty. She had fired all 24 torpedoes. She had sunk 10 ships in a single patrol, a record that stunned the Pacific Fleet Command. O'Kane turned the boat for home. But the journey back was just as dangerous. They had to cross the minefields again. On the way back, they spotted one last target, a Japanese freighter loaded down with cargo. The crew looked at O'Kane. "We have no torpedoes." O'Kane looked at the deck gun. The Tang carried a 4-inch 50 caliber gun on the forward deck. It was a weapon of last resort, requiring the gun crew to stand exposed on the wet steel while the submarine rolled in the waves. Battle station surface. Man the deck gun. The Tang surfaced. The gun crew scrambled out. They engaged the freighter in an old-fashioned artillery duel. The Japanese ship fired back with machine guns and light cannon. Bullets pinned off the Tang's conning tower. But the American gunners were better. They pumped shell after shell into the freighter's WATERLIN. The freighter caught fire and listed. It sank slowly. It was the final punctuation mark on a patrol that had rewritten the book on submarine warfare. When the Tang pulled into Pearl Harbor, she was greeted as a conquering hero. Admiral Nimitz came down to the dock to shake O'Kane's hand. The battle flag flying from the periscope was so crowded with symbols, it practically dragged in the water, but the men were exhausted. They had lived in a state of hyperadrenaline for weeks. They had lost weight. Their skin was pale and covered in rashes. They jumped at loud noises. O'Kane was awarded another Navy Cross. The press hailed the Tang as the scourge of the Yellow Sea. But in the quiet of the officers' club, O'Kane knew the truth. They had survived because of skill, Yes, but also because of luck. Fighting on the surface, fighting in shallow water, it was a game of Russian roulette. Every time you pulled the trigger and didn't die, the odds of the next pull killing you went up. And there was another problem looming on the horizon, a technological demon that had plagued the submarine force since the start of the war. A demon that lived inside their own torpedoes. O'Kane had mastered the enemy, but he couldn't master the flaws in his own weapons. And as the Tang prepared for her next patrols, the Mark 18 electric torpedo was waiting in the tubes, a weapon that was faster, silent, and as fate would have it, treacherous. Asterisk, by August 1944, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new phase. The United States Navy had effectively severed the arteries of the Japanese Empire. Japan was an island nation with no natural resources. It needed oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, and rice from Indochina. Without these, its factories would stop, its planes would be grounded, and its people would starve. The job of the U.S. submarine force was to turn the shipping lanes into a graveyard. And they were succeeding. The waters off the coast of Honshu, the main island of Japan, became a kill zone. Japanese captains called it Hell's Sea. They sailed in terror, hugging the coastline, knowing that at night, the American Wolfpacks would rise from the depths. This period became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in the air. But under the water, a similar slaughter was taking place. It was a time of unprecedented target availability. And right in the center of the shooting gallery was the USS Tang. On July 31, 1944, Dick O'Kane took the Tang out for her fourth patrol. His orders were to patrol the waters off the southern coast of Honshu. He was hunting in the enemy's front yard. This patrol would go down in history as a masterclass in submarine warfare. On the night of August 11th, the Tang's radar picked up a massive blip. It was a convoy, 2 large freighters and a tanker, protected by 2 destroyer escorts. In the early days of the war, a submarine might have fired a long-range shot and dove. But this was 1944, and this was Dick O'Kane. He ordered battle stations. Surface. The Tang raced in at 80 knots. O'Kane positioned the boat between the convoy and the shore, cutting off their escape route. The Japanese ships were silhouetted against the open ocean. O'Kane didn't just pick one target. He engaged them all simultaneously. Fire 1, fire 2. The first freighter was hit. It broke in half and sank in 2 minutes. Fire 3, fire 4. The tanker exploded. The burning oil spread across the water, illuminating the Tang like a stage. Spotlight. The Japanese escorts, blinded by the fire and confused by the speed of the attack, began firing wildly into the darkness. They couldn't believe a submarine was on the surface in the middle of their formation. They assumed they were under air attack or had hit a minefield. O'Kane spun the boat, bringing his stern tubes to bear on the last freighter. 2 more torpedoes. 2 more hits. In less than 10 minutes, the entire convoy was gone. The Tang vanished into the dark, leaving the destroyers hunting ghosts among the wreckage. The destruction of merchant shipping was a grim business. These ships weren't just carrying coal. They were often carrying men, reinforcements for the garrisons on Iwo Jima and the Philippines. When a troop transport was torpedoed, thousands of soldiers ended up in the water. The rules of submarine warfare were harsh. There was no room to take prisoners. A submarine with 80 men cannot rescue 2,000 enemy soldiers. Survivors of the Tang recall the sound of the hull cutting through debris fields. They heard the thumping of bodies against the steel plates. They saw the water choked with crates, life vests, and men. O'Kane was a professional warrior, not a murderer. He didn't machine gun survivors in the water, a practice some other captains, on both sides, were accused of. But he didn't stop either. To stop was to die. He noted the sinking in the logbook, verified the tonnage, and moved on to the next target. The psychological toll of leaving thousands to drown was buried under the necessity of the mission. The Logic was cold. Every soldier who drowns here is one less soldier shooting at Marines at a beachhead. The pace of the 4th Patrol was relentless. On August 22nd, the Tang engaged another convoy. This time, O'Kane fired 9 torpedoes in a single engagement. 3 ships went down. On August 23rd, he sank the Tsukushi Maru. On August 25th, he sank the tanker Nanko Maru #8. The Tang was firing torpedoes faster than the crew could reload them. The torpedomen in the forward and aft rooms were working in a sweat-drenched frenzy. Wrestling a 3,000-pound torpedo from the storage rack into the tube in a pitching submarine was backbreaking, dangerous work, but they did it with a rhythm born of victory. They knew every fish they loaded was a guaranteed kill. They trusted the old man. By the end of August, the Tang was out of torpedoes again. But O'Kane wasn't done. On the way home, they spotted a small Japanese patrol boat. It wasn't worth a torpedo, even if they had one. O'Kane ordered the deck guns manned. He brought the Tang alongside the patrol boat and engaged in a broadside duel. The 4-inch gun barked, smashing the wooden hull of the enemy vessel. The 20mm Oerlikon cannons shredded the deck. It was an act of supreme confidence. The Tang was acting like a battleship. When they finally arrived back at Pearl Harbor on September 3, 1944, the score was staggering. In a single patrol, O'Kane claimed to have sunk 8 ships. Post-war analysis, JANAC, confirmed nearly 30,000 tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom in 34 days. The Tang was now the leading submarine in the Pacific Fleet. O'Kane was a celebrity within the service, but amidst the celebration, a dark cloud was forming. The sheer volume of torpedoes the Tang was firing meant they were cycling through their inventory fast. They were relying heavily on the Mark 18 electric torpedo, a new battery-powered weapon that didn't leave a bubble trail like the old steam torpedoes. The Mark 18 was silent. It was deadly, but it had a flaw that the Bureau of Ordnance knew about, but had failed to fully fix. A flaw that turned the hunter's weapon into a boomerang. As the Tang prepared for her 5th patrol, the patrol that was supposed to be her victory lap, the crew loaded 24 Mark 18 torpedoes into the racks. They didn't know it, but they were loading the instrument of their own destruction. To understand why the Tang was doomed, we have to look back at the greatest scandal in the history of the U.S. Navy. For the first 2 years of the war, American submarine captains had reported a nightmare scenario. They would fire a perfect shot. Here the torpedo hit the hull of the enemy ship, and hear a metallic clang, no explosion. A dud, or worse, the torpedo would run too deep, passing harmlessly under the target, or worst of all, it would circle. The Mark 14 steam torpedo was infamous for its defects. The magnetic exploder didn't work. The contact exploder was too fragile. A direct hit at a 90-degree angle would crush the detonator without setting it off. Captains like Mush Morton and Dick O'Kane had raged against the Bureau of Ordnance. They had risked their lives to get into firing position, only to watch their weapons bounce off the enemy. By 1944, the Mark 14 had been largely fixed, or replaced by the electric Mark 18. The Mark 18 was supposed to be the solution. It was based on a captured German G-70 torpedo. It was trackless, allowing for daylight attacks without giving away the sub's position. But the Mark 18 had a sensitivity issue in its rudder controls. If the torpedo was not maintained perfectly, or if the battery temperature wasn't just right, the rudder could jam hard over immediately upon launch. If the rudder jammed, the torpedo wouldn't go straight. It would enter a tight powered turn. It would become a circular run. A torpedo traveling at 30 knots completes a circle in a matter of seconds. And at the center of that circle sits the submarine that fired it. As the Tang crew enjoyed their shore leave in Pearl Harbor, drinking at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, the ordnance men were hoisting the Mark 18s into the belly of the boat. One of those torpedoes was flawed. It sat in the rack, a silent time bomb, waiting for the command to fire. Imagine being a sniper. You crawl through the mud for days. You stalk your target. You calculate the wind, the distance, and the angle. You have the enemy general in your crosshairs. You pull the trigger, and a flag pops out that says bang. Or worse, the bullet makes a U-turn and comes back at your own head. This was the reality for the United States submarine force for the first 2 years of World War II. They possessed the finest submarines in the world. They had the best trained crews. They had aggressive captains like Dick O'Kane, but they went to war with a weapon that was fundamentally broken. The Mark 14 torpedo was a technological marvel on paper. It cost $10,000 in 1940 money, the price of 3 houses. It was designed to run deep, pass under the keel of an enemy ship, and detonate using a secret magnetic exploder, breaking the ship's back. In reality, it was a dud. When the war started, captains reported hitting Japanese ships and hearing a metallic clang, but no explosion. They reported firing perfect shots that ran 10 feet deeper than set, passing harmlessly under the target. The Bureau of Ordnance, BORD, in Washington, D.C., the admirals responsible for the weapons refused to believe the reports. They blamed the captains. They claimed the skippers were bad shots, or cowardly, or lying. It took brave captains conducting unauthorized field tests to prove the Bureau wrong. They discovered 3 fatal flaws. It ran too deep. The pressure sensors were calibrated incorrectly. The magnetic exploder didn't work. It often exploded prematurely or not at all. The contact exploder was too fragile. If you hit a ship at a perfect 90-degree angle, the firing pin would crush instead of firing. You literally had to hit the enemy glancingly to kill him. By 1943, after months of screaming matches and lost opportunities, the Navy finally fixed the Mark 14. They disabled the magnetic exploder and reinforced the firing pin. But just as the steam torpedoes were getting fixed, a new player entered the game. A weapon that was silent, trackless, and deadly. The Mark 18 electric torpedo was the Navy's answer to the German U-boat success. Based on captured German technology, it used batteries instead of a steam turbine. For a captain like Dick O'Kane, the Mark 18 was a dream. It left no wake. A steam torpedo left a bright white trail of bubbles that pointed right back to the sub. The Mark 18 was invisible. It required less maintenance in the tubes. It was mass-produced and readily available. By 1944, the Tang and many other boats were carrying a mixed-load Mark 14s for long-range shots and Mark 18s for the stealth kills. But the Mark 18 had a ghost in the machine. It was heavy and slow to accelerate. When it was launched from the tube, it was sluggish. And crucially, its rudder control system was highly sensitive to friction and battery voltage. If the torpedo was not serviced perfectly, or if a switch corroded, or if the launch angle was too steep, the rudder could jam. If the rudder jammed hard over, the moment it left the tube, the torpedo would not go straight. It would begin a tight-powered turn. Submariners called it a circular run. It is the ultimate nightmare scenario. You fire a weapon, and it turns around to hunt you. Mark 18 torpedo travels at about 29 knots. The turning radius of a jammed rudder is tight. A circling torpedo will complete a 360-degree turn in roughly 4 to 6 minutes, depending on the size of the circle. But it doesn't just circle once, it spirals. And if the submarine is moving forward chasing a convoy, for example, it moves directly into the path of the returning weapon. The geometry is terrifying. If you fire from the bow tubes while moving forward, and the torpedo turns left or right, it will arc back around and intersect your course near the stern. The Navy knew this was a possibility. There were protocols. If a circular run is detected, dive deep immediately. Turn the boat away from the turn of the torpedo. But detection was the problem. in the heat of a surface battle, with deck guns firing and explosions lighting up the night, hearing the sonar signature of a single torpedo coming back was nearly impossible. The fleet had already received a grim warning. In March 1944, the submarine USS Tullibee vanished. For a long time, the Navy assumed she was lost to depth charges, but there was one survivor. Gunner's mate C.W. Kuykendall had been standing on the bridge when he was blown into the water. He survived the war in a Japanese prison camp and returned. To tell the tale, he reported that the Tullibee had fired a torpedo at a transport. Seconds later, the boat was rocked by a massive explosion. The Tullibee had been hit by her own torpedo. The story was whispered in the officers' clubs at Pearl Harbor. It was the boogeyman story of the silent service. Don't trust the fish. They bite back. September 1944. Pearl Harbor. The crew of the USS Tang was preparing for her 5th war patrol. The mood was high. They were the champions. They were going back to the Taiwan Strait, Formosa Strait, another shallow, dangerous choke. Point for Japanese shipping. The ordnance men lowered the torpedoes into the loading hatches. The Tang took on a full load, 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes. O'Kane preferred the electrics for their stealth. He wanted to get in close on the surface, fire, and vanish without a bubble trail giving him away. The torpedomen, led by the experienced Clay Decker, greased the torpedoes. They checked the battery levels. They inspected the gyros. They did everything by the book. But inside one of those steel cylinders, perhaps torpedo number 23 or 24, a mechanical flaw was waiting. A switch was loose. A valve was sticky. A wire was frayed. It sat in the rack in the forward torpedo room, indistinguishable from the others. It looked like a weapon of victory. It was in fact a death warrant. O'Kane and his men boarded the boat. They waved goodbye to the hula girls and the band on the pier. They sailed past the wreck of the USS Arizona. They were heading out to break their own records. They were heading into the fiercest waters of the war. And they were carrying the enemy with them, locked inside their own hull. The Tang would never see Pearl Harbor again. October 1944. The Pacific War was reaching its climax. The United States Navy was preparing for the largest naval battle in history, the invasion of the Philippines at Leyte Gulf. To stop the American invasion, Japan needed to rush reinforcements from the home islands to the Philippines. They had to move thousands of troops, tons of ammunition, and precious fuel through a narrow corridor of water between China and the island of Formosa, Taiwan. This was the Taiwan Strait. It was a funnel. And waiting at the narrowest part of that funnel was the USS Tang. Dick O'Kane had brought his boat into the strait with a single purpose: to cut the supply line. The Tang was operating alone. There were no other American submarines in her sector to help, and no friendly aircraft to provide cover. The waters were treacherous, shallow, filled with strong currents, and patrolled by Japanese aircraft and hunter-killer groups. But O'Kane knew the targets would be there. On the night of October 23rd, the radar screen lit up. It was a massive convoy. 3 large tankers, a transport, and a freighter, protected by a ring of destroyers. Most submarine captains would have fired from a distance or picked off a straggler. O'Kane chose violence. He ordered battle stations. Surface. The Tang raced into the middle of the convoy at 20 knots. It was a chaotic, dark night with poor visibility, perfect for a surface attack. The Japanese ships loomed out of the darkness like mountains. O'Kane maneuvered the Tang between the columns of enemy ships. He was so close to the tankers that the crew on the bridge could smell the crude oil and hear the Japanese lookouts shouting, "Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 3 torpedoes slammed into 3 different ships. The darkness erupted into walls of flame. The Japanese escorts went berserk. They couldn't find the submarine in the confusion of burning ships and smoke. They began firing at each other. They dropped depth charges on random patches of water. O'Kane didn't leave. He stayed in the middle of the burning convoy, spinning the boat to fire his stern tubes. He sank a freighter. Then he sank a tanker. In one night, the Tang had turned a reinforcement convoy into a bonfire, but the Tang didn't get away cleanly. A Japanese transport, seeing the submarine illuminated by the fire of a burning tanker, turned to ram. The huge steel bow of the transport bore down on the Tang. O'Kane shouted for emergency flank speed. The Tang's diesels roared. The submarine surged forward, crossing the bow of the transport with only yards to spare. The Japanese ship missed the Tang, but in the confusion, it rammed another Japanese ship instead. O'Kane watched from the bridge as the two enemy vessels collided with a screech of tearing metal. The Tang slipped away into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation. The crew in the control room wiped the sweat from their eyes. They had survived barely. The next night, October 24th, the radar lit up again, another massive convoy. This one was even bigger, tankers laden with planes and fuel for the defense of the Philippines. The Tang was running low on torpedoes, but O'Kane couldn't let them pass. He repeated the tactic. He drove the Tang into the center of the formation. Battle that followed was the fiercest of O'Kane's career. The Japanese were ready this time. Searchlights swept the water. Deck guns fired. The Tang fired torpedoes at a tanker. Boom! She fired at a transport. Boom! The torpedoes were running hot and straight. The Mark 18s were doing their job flawlessly. The Tang was firing so fast that the torpedo room crews were exhausted. They were wrestling the reloads into the tubes, slick with sweat and hydraulic fluid, sliding on the deck as the boat heeled. Over in sharp turns. Frank Springer, the chief torpedoman, reported to the bridge. "Captain, we are down to the last two fish." O'Kane looked at the burning ocean. He had decimated the convoy, but there was one ship left, a crippled transport, dead in the water but refusing to sink. It was a sitting duck. It was 2 a.m. On October 25th, 1944, the Tang had fired 22 torpedoes. 22 hits. It was a perfect patrol. O'Kane decided to finish the job. He ordered the Tang to approach the crippled transport. He wanted to make sure it didn't limp back to port. He lined up the shot. He would use his 23rd torpedo. Fire! The torpedo left the tube. It ran straight and true. It struck the transport amidships. The explosion broke the ship's back. It began to sink. O'Kane had one torpedo left. Torpedo number 24. It was a Mark 18 electric. It had been sitting in the tube, ready to go. O'Kane could have brought it home. He could have saved it as a souvenir. But O'Kane was a warrior. He saw another damaged ship in the distance. He decided to expend the last round. He maneuvered the Tang for a stern shot. He lined up the crosshairs. He checked the settings. Range, 900 yards. Speed, low. Depth, 6 feet. The crew in the conning tower was relaxed. They were already thinking about the voyage home. They were talking about the welcome they would get in Pearl Harbor. They were the champions. O'Kane gave the order that would end his command. "Stand by. Fire." The boat shuddered. The compressed air hissed. Torpedo number 24 left the tube. On the bridge, O'Kane watched the wake. The Mark 18 is supposed to be trackless, but in the phosphorescent water of the Taiwan Strait, you could see the disturbance. The torpedo left the tube, but instead of diving to its running depth, it broached. It popped out of the water like a dolphin, splashing back down. This happens sometimes. Usually, the torpedo corrects itself and keeps going, but number 24 didn't go straight. As soon as it hit the water, the rudder jammed hard to the left. The torpedo began a sharp, powered turn. O'Kane saw the phosphorescent wake curving. It wasn't heading for the enemy. It was heading back toward the Tang. Emergency speed. All ahead flank, O'Kane screamed. Right full rudder. He tried to turn the submarine inside the turning radius of the torpedo. He tried to outrun it, but the Tang was heavy. She took seconds to build up speed. The torpedo was already moving at 30 knots. The men on the bridge watched in paralyzed horror. They saw the wake completing the circle. It was a perfect geometry of death. The torpedo completed a 180-degree turn. It was aiming directly for the Tang's stern. O'Kane shouted, "Close the hatch." It was too late. 20 seconds after it was fired. Torpedo number 24 struck the USS Tang in the aft torpedo room, the very room it had just been loaded from. The explosion was deafening. The back of the submarine was blown open. The Pacific Ocean rushed into the aft compartments, instantly drowning the men there. The Tang's stern dropped like a stone. The bow rose into the air. Dick O'Kane, standing on the bridge, was whipped around by the violent motion. He was thrown into the water, surrounded by the swirling debris of his own ship. As he surfaced, gasping for air, he watched the USS Tang slide backward into the black water. She didn't sink immediately. She settled on the bottom. And inside the forward compartments, men were still alive. The greatest hunter in the Pacific had just been killed by its own arrow. But the story wasn't over. For the men trapped 180 feet down, the real nightmare was just beginning. October 25th, 1944, 2:30 a.m. The USS Tang hit the bottom of the Taiwan Strait with a jarring, bone-shattering thud. She settled by the stern. Her bow pointed upward at a sharp angle. The depth gauge in the control room was smashed, but the pressure in the ears of the survivors told them they were deep. They were 180 feet, 55 meters down. Inside the steel tube, the world had turned upside down. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim, red glow of the emergency battle lanterns. The air was instantly filled with the acrid, choking smoke of an electrical fire. The torpedo impact in the stern had been catastrophic. The aft torpedo room, the maneuvering room, and the engine rooms were flooded instantly. Everyone in the back half of the boat, over 30 men, was dead before they knew what hit them. In the control room, chaos reigned. The boat was flooding. The bulkhead door leading aft was groaning under the immense pressure of the water behind it. The survivors knew the drill. They had to move forward. They had to get to the forward torpedo room. It was the designated escape compartment. Men scrambled through the darkened passageways, climbing uphill against the steep angle of the deck. They dragged wounded shipmates. They were coughing, eyes watering from the smoke. They squeezed through the heavy watertight door into the forward room and dogged it shut. They were safe from the water, but they were trapped in a steel coffin. In the cramped confines of the forward torpedo room, normally home to 15 men, nearly 40 survivors were now huddled. The air was already getting foul. The heat from the battery fire in the compartment below was radiating through the deck plates. The paint on the bulkheads began to blister and peel. There were no officers present. Captain O'Kane and the bridge crew were gone, presumed dead on the surface. The senior man in the room was Lieutenant Junior Grade Mel Enos, but in the chaos, leadership fell to the experienced chiefs and petty officers like Clay Decker and Pete Naro and Ski. They took stock of their situation. Oxygen limited. With 40 men breathing rapidly in panic, the carbon dioxide levels were rising fast. Hull integrity. The hull was groaning but holding. Escape method. The Tang was equipped with an escape trunk and Momsen lungs. The Momsen lung was a primitive rebreather, a kongsa rubber bag strapped to the chest that scrubbed carbon dioxide from exhaled air, allowing a man to breathe underwater for a short time. But using it required a terrifying procedure. They couldn't just open the hatch. The pressure of the ocean outside, 80 pounds per square inch, PSI, would keep it sealed shut. To open the hatch, they had to flood the compartment to equalize the pressure. They had to let the ocean in. The debate in the torpedo room was intense. Some men argued they should wait. The Navy will send a rescue bell, they said. They'll find us. Others knew the truth. They were in enemy waters right off the coast of China. The US Navy didn't even know they were sunk yet. No rescue bell was coming. The choice was brutal. Stay in the dry room and slowly suffocate as the CO2 rose, or burn to death as the fire below ate through the deck. Flood the room, fight the crushing pressure, and try to swim 180 feet to the surface. Fire made the decision for them. Smoke began to curl up through the seams in the floor. The rubber gaskets on the torpedo tubes began to melt. The heat became unbearable. They decided to attempt the escape. The escape trunk was a small airlock located in the ceiling of the torpedo room. It was a steel cylinder, barely big enough for 4 men to stand in. The procedure was a nightmare of physics. 4 or 5 men would climb into the tiny trunk. The bottom hatch would be sealed. The men inside would open a valve to flood the trunk with seawater until the water reached their chests. The air pressure in the remaining space would compress, equalizing with the ocean outside. This rapid pressurization was agonizing. Eardrums would burst. Sinuses would scream. Once the pressure was equal, they could open the side door and swim out. Then, the trunk had to be drained and depressurized so the next group could use it. It was a slow, mechanical process, and they were running out of time. The first group of volunteers climbed into the trunk. Among them was Clay Decker. They sealed the hatch. They opened the flood valves. The water rushed in, cold and black. The air pressure spiked. Inside the trunk, the men struggled to breathe. The Momsen lungs were tricky to use. You had to bite down on the mouthpiece and breathe rhythmically. If you panicked and spat it out, you drowned. They pushed the side door open. The Pacific Ocean awaited. They pulled themselves out of the hatch and began the ascent. Ascending from 180 feet is dangerous. If you hold your breath, the expanding air in your lungs will rupture them, an air embolism. You have to exhale continuously all the way up. They climbed up the buoy line, a rope attached to a buoy released from the sub. They rose through the darkness, their lungs burning, the nitrogen bubbles forming in their blood. When they broke the surface, they gasped for air. They were alive. But they were alone in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, surrounded by oil and debris. Back inside the sub, the situation was deteriorating. The trunk mechanism was complex. After the first few groups escaped, the process began to fail. The crew inside was suffering from carbon dioxide poisoning and nitrogen narcosis, the rapture of the deep. Their thinking became fuzzy. They made mistakes. They struggled to drain the trunk for the next group. They turned the wrong valves. Arguments broke out. Some men simply gave up. The terror of the freezing water and the crushing pressure was too much. They chose the gentle death. They went back to their bunks, lay down, and allowed the asphyxiation to take them. Survivors recall seeing shipmates sitting quietly, staring at photos of their families waiting for the end. The heat from the fire below grew intense. The paint on the walls caught fire. The torpedo room turned into an oven. Eventually, the pressure inside the room itself became so high due to leaks that the explosive decompression occurred. The hatch blew open or was forced. The ocean rushed in. The last few men were swept out of the boat, not by the escape trunk, but by the sheer violence of the air bubble bursting. Of the 40 men who had gathered in the forward torpedo room, only 13 made it out of the escape trunk. And of those 13, only 8 reached the surface alive. 5 died from the bends or drowning during the ascent. The morning of October 25th revealed a grim scene on the surface. There were 2 groups of survivors. The bridge group, Captain Dick O'Kane and about 8 others who had been blown off the bridge when the sub went down. They had been treading water for 8 hours without life vests, clinging to a crate. The escape group, The men who had come up from the bottom, suffering from the bends, bleeding from the nose and ears. They floated in the oil slick, exhausted. They were miles from land, but they were not alone. The Japanese destroyer escorts, the very ships the Tang had been attacking, were still in the area, looking for survivors from their own sunken merchant ships. A Japanese frigate, CD-34, spotted the oil slick. It moved in. The American sailors, delirious and dying, waved. They didn't care that it was the enemy. They just wanted out of the water. The Japanese sailors pulled them aboard. At first, the treatment was brutal. The Japanese were furious. Their convoy had been decimated. They beat the American survivors with clubs. They kicked them. They threatened to behead them, but they didn't kill them. Captain O'Kane, barely conscious, identified himself. The Japanese officers realized they had captured a high-value prize. This was the captain who had terrorized their shipping lanes. Of the 87 men on board the USS Tang, only 9 survived the night. 5 from the escape trunk, 4 from the bridge, including O'Kane. They were taken to the infamous Ofuna prisoner of war camp in Japan. They were interrogated, starved, and kept in solitary confinement. They were treated as war criminals rather than pose because of the devastation they had caused. Dick O'Kane weighed less than 90 pounds when he was liberated in August 1945. When the war ended, the full story of the Tang emerged. The Navy reviewed the records. They reviewed the JANAC scores. Even with her career cut short, the Tang was officially credited with sinking 24 Japanese ships totaling 93,824 tons and damaging many more. In terms of number of ships sunk per patrol, the Tang was the deadliest submarine in the history of the United States Navy. Richard O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman, but O'Kane never celebrated the medal. For the rest of his life, he was haunted by the memory of the men he left behind at 180 feet. He thought of the men who chose to stay in their bunks. He thought of the circular run. The USS Tang sits there still, rusting in the silt of the Taiwan Strait. It is a war grave, a monument to the aggression of a captain who pushed the limits, and the tragedy of a weapon that worked too well. They were the elite of the silent service. And in the end, the only thing that could kill the Tang was the Tang itself. Thank you for listening to Iron Coffins, The Secret War of the USS Tang on History by Blood, a Audiobook. If this deep dive into the claustrophobic terror of submarine warfare captivated you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments below. If you were trapped in the forward torpedo room, would you have tried the escape trunk, or would you have stayed behind?